Right, so I'm just going to take a moment to introduce the panel, and then we'll get right into the questions. So I'm joined today by Greg Collins from Exact Ventures, industry analyst, Gary Testa from Polycom, Ronald Kahn from T-Metrics, contact center specialist, Matt Townend from Cavell Group, who's also an industry analyst who's going to help us take a worldwide view, and of course, last but not least, Robert Kulhawi from Alternate Communications, who's he describes himself as the boots on the ground for network transformation. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get into the first question. If we could, Teresa, and you could advance the slides for us. What I'd like to do is start with some general observations. So I thought it'd be great, since we have two industry analysts on the panel, just to kind of give a wide-ranging view of the world. And Matt, I'm going to start with you, since we've had a lot of North American speakers. Let's take a look at some of the rest of the world.
Yeah, I was nearly tempted to join the TIA earlier. So I get the chance in 2 minutes to talk about the rest of the world. So it's pretty hard to give you a kind of a view. But what I would say from our work is we see some general trends. So there's general structural drivers which are present in every market. They generally are around the availability of good access, the business demographic. So as you look in different markets, particularly in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, where we work, you'll find very different business demographics between markets. So if you looked at the UK, it's a very U-shaped demographic, so lots of very small businesses and lots of very big businesses. If you look in Germany, it's more of a gradual market with lots of medium and large-sized businesses. And so you see very different uptake depending on the business demographic. Generally, what we've seen hosted UC work is in the very small and very large. The other big factor that we see in markets is regulation. So, numbering, which is a bane of most people's lives in most of the markets that we work in. The other themes we see is the competition. So it's a very different picture in different markets. To give you an idea, in Europe, in Germany, there'll be about 20 providers who have got a UC switch. In the UK, there's 83. So you get very different competition. And the final factor that really affects things is the role of the incumbent. So one thing you can't get away with in these markets is the idea of what the incumbent's doing. So in certain markets, incumbents have really adopted the technology, and that tends to drive the whole market. And in other markets, they've really put up barriers to the market. The last point I would make in terms of a theme is where we're seeing success. So the people who are having success in the hosted market are the people who really understand all bundling. So people who really think about what the proposition is to the customer and put out really tight bundles, particularly in the SME. So people have really thought about that and put it together. The other thing that we talked a lot about during the conference is people who really think about business process. So how do you really make your solution relevant to the business processes of the businesses you're trying to sell to? And they're kind of some of the themes. I don't want to take up I could talk for about an hour. So maybe we'll just move on and we'll come back to some other questions later.
Greg, what do you think? What's happening? You have a very North American-centric view based on a lot of the work you're doing. What do you think is happening?
So in North America, I'm going to talk first a little bit about SIP trunks. So for several years, SIP trunks have been a big driver of new services for service providers. I did a study recently that shows SIP trunks, there's maybe 30 or 40% penetration in North America for SIP trunks. So it's been a big growth engine. And to a certain degree, getting to that 30% penetration has been low-hanging fruit for service providers. And now that the penetration rate is increasing, the competition's intensifying, the pricing comes down a lot for SIP trunks. So for service providers, and part of this study that I did was, well, can you segment SIP trunk services? Are there advanced SIP trunk services? Are there basic SIP trunk services? And what I found was that, yes, indeed, you could segment SIP trunk services. There's sort of a basic level that's very much a commodity, and lots of people don't want to be in a commodity business. They'd rather be in not a connectivity business, but a communications business. And then even longer term, the real potential in the market is in selling the hosted services and getting away from selling generic commodity connectivity and getting more into the communication services. A lot of the candy type of services, the Nuvia type of services that we talked about.
Well, with that
through the
in mind, I
conference.
think I'd be curious to know. I'm wondering, right? Is the whole concept of this panel name? I picked the name, so I guess you can blame me. But I called it the Unified Communications Panel. But is the whole concept of the name really starting to get dated? Right? Is sort of the idea of this one client that you go to do all of your communications, is that really being sort of eclipsed by what we're doing with WebRTC and the whole embedded communications environment? And Gary, you have a thought about that?
Yeah, well, so what we're seeing in the market, and this is kind of on a global level, is that people are making decisions within their enterprise based on a particular set of criteria, a service at a time. So while we talk about UC, what I often find is that enterprise customers will choose a particular service, whether that's IM&P, whether that's voice, and then they'll focus their efforts on solving that problem. Whatever they start with tends to then lead to the next step. So what they're looking for oftentimes, and this depends if it's SMB or large enterprise or mid-enterprise, is how important that first step is and how successful it is. So if you focus on voice, which is where a lot of folks are starting there, they may already have an IMP, but they often focus on voice because it's mission critical, and it's real time, and it's really hard, right? I mean, that's the part of all this UC thing that I think is quite interesting as I talk to customers, is that near real time is actually quite easy. Real-time communications is very difficult, and to get right, you have to be very focused and very successful. And once you're successful there, you've got their confidence to kind of leverage in the rest of that solution. So I would agree with you.
Anyone else have a thought?
Yeah, I think one thing with UC, my service provider customers are finding it very dated. So, because UC, people seem to think unified means one. So to have a UC solution, you buy one solution from one supplier. What it's really now about is how we integrate relevant applications into business process, or we're seeing a lot of traction where people are integrating into certain key applications. So they're integrating maybe into CRM, or they're integrating into call center applications. So it's about understanding the business processes and making sure you can integrate your solution into those business processes, be that via an application, be that into a broader business process. So I think UC is kind of a technology dead term.
Well, Ronnie, I think that sort of leads to an interesting question around the cloud. Now, your business has traditionally, the contact center business, has probably been traditionally one of the most, on-premises centric businesses in the world from a telecommunications perspective. In 2015, we seem to be seeing a tipping point for cloud UC and contact center. Do you think that's happening? And if so, why do you think it's finally hit that threshold?
Okay. I'm not sure if it's 2015 or 2016, but it's excuse me, it's approaching. I think what is happening is we're all learning, as being in business, that we're best at doing at what we do to raise money, to raise revenue, and we're not so good at. I'll expand it beyond that. We're not so good at figuring out what's the best health care for our employees, or the insurance to buy, or things along those lines. And okay, everybody in this room is a nerd. So get beyond the nerd community, and we don't know that much about communications. So putting it in the cloud starts pushing that responsibility outside the organization. So I think it is coming. We're at a point right now where the reason why I'm not willing to declare 2015 that tip point is there's still a lot of processes to go through to make it seamless to the end user, because that's what they're drawn to.
I got a quick comment on
Yeah.
that. We're seeing that the move for call center to the cloud is actually accelerating in a big way. And I'll leverage on one thing. I think what we found out is that call centers are difficult to operate at scale. I think also that they're having a more and more difficult time finding good employees, particularly as we resource back into the United States. We saw that in North America. We saw a big outsourcing of that. Now as they source back, it's hard to find all the employees in one location. So what we're seeing is a very distributed call center that can only be delivered successfully through the cloud.
Yeah, and we're able to do that. We see a lot of that. We're trying to be very geographically independent. You know, instead of just being in the same cubes next to each other, why not be in this bungalow down in Key West answering calls? Which, by the
Or
way,
maybe on a boat, in your case,
yeah, on
Ronnie.
a boat, right. By the way, I was hoping I could do the panel from a Gen Band bungalow down in Key West. So.
We'll work on that for you.
Thank you.
I might actually be the moderator of that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Well, so if we do start moving, if we do take the view that this migration to the cloud is going to happen over the next several years, I mean, fundamentally, what do we think is going to happen to the service provider business model? Do we think we're going to see a massive realignment in staffing and costs? And I know, Robert, that's an area you probably have a lot of passion in, so I'll let you take that.
Sure, and I appreciate that. And I think that's, anytime you've got this much change in an industry, where you've got an industry that's going from a very traditional model where it has a huge market share and the carriers control really all pieces, to now where there's so many competing different groups and individuals, you internet, you get everything moving. What that happens is that creates so much change, and when that change, it creates the need for so many additional services and so many additional pieces for a short period of time. So if you're adding in a traditional connectivity piece, that's going to be very low margin and will continue to be more like what you call it, a trunk or a truck or a connectivity process. But all the pieces that add in and all that network transformation all requires expertise, and that expertise will require isn't something that any of the big carriers can afford to have that anymore. So if you're used to having 200,000 employees, you'll see these carriers go down to 40,000 or 50,000 in the next 5 to 10 years. And so how do you now make up for those skill sets? So it's a lot like a home builder, where a home builder hires they don't keep plumbers on staff, they don't keep carpenters, they don't keep electricians. They bring in specialized resources to assist in specialized trades. And in telecom, those trades are even more difficult because they're require much more expertise, many more years of training. And so that requires an alliance and with a very special service provider. So that's what we're seeing a movement toward, is the only way that a carrier will be successful in the future will be really leveraging the variable cost scenarios.
Comments about that?
Yeah. So I'm not so sure that there's going to be this massive change in service providers, because I think service providers have been through quite a lot of change already. So service providers I deal with have got rid of all their men's in vans many years ago who are doing the installations. They're still insulating and putting in a data network. So, you know, they'll still keep those resources. I think the biggest change actually is going to be in how the hell they sell this stuff. And I think it's the biggest challenge, and how they transform their salespeople from selling data plans and lines to business transformation, or the promises that UC seems to, or the word UC seems to offer. How we get, and that's the biggest challenge we're facing as a consultancy business at the moment, is working with service providers who try and change their go-to-market and sales channel to be successful. Because it's no longer a simple sale. If you really want to go after business process transformation, it's a struggle to do that with the same sales. It's the same, actually, by the way, for Genband, who are moving to the cloud themselves. I hate to worry some of the Genband salespeople in the room, but you know, you're now going to be selling cloud services and business transformation to your service providers and through your service providers, and that's a real challenge. So, I mean, I don't know your piece so well, so there probably is that, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
And I think, but it all boils down to, if you are running a business and you're a CEO, you've got to deliver results for your shareholders. You have to deliver results for your private equity partners, whoever you're funding this or using it to fund it. And keeping those costs under control are so critical. And so the idea of having people that, as these industries change and as these features change, it requires an entirely different skill set. So you can't afford to keep somebody on for 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years and then have to train for the next skill set. So I think that you've got to deliver results, and the way you deliver results is a variable cost base. And that's moved to many industries, not just our industry, but other industries that are much more, have gone through very competitive cycles that we're just starting to go through now. So I think that there's a lot of truth to the fact they've got to absolutely sell more, they've got to get very creative on how they bundle. That's critical. I don't want to negate the fact that you also have to work on the cost factor and the efficiency factor, and that's going to happen through variable cost.
Greg, I think also following actually on both of them, the role of the sales engineer is going to be critical. I mean, things are changing so fast that a salesperson who's got to be out there beating the bushes hasn't got time to be deep enough on this technology, because you get into an individual site and you've got to know what they want particular, and you've got to go deep on it. And I think the sales engineer is going to have to be the one that fulfills that role.
So we talked a little bit about service provider. What about, it's interesting, there's been a lot of conversations recently. You know, we've seen Skype for Business, Cisco announced Spark, several other products. But nobody's talking about what happens to the VAR in this whole model and what happens to their business model. And so do we think, I mean, you know, most of us know today that if we own a small or medium-sized business and we have a problem, there's some guy who shows up in a van and comes with a screwdriver or whatever and fixes it. So what's going to happen when we move to this cloud model, and what happens to the VAR's business? And Gary, I'm going to throw that to you, because that's an area you touch.
An area that for Polycom is actually one of the areas where we differentiate ourselves, because I think when you talk about some of the other large vendors that are out there, their first reaction is very simple. I'm going to squeeze the VAR out because that's where my margin growth is going to come from. I mean, I make a living against Cisco on exactly that behavior. They, on a regular basis, will come in, cut out their partner, who they've probably worked with for a very long time, in order to achieve growth and margin. So I think what you have to do if you're a VAR, and if you have to do as a service provider, is you have to choose your partners very carefully. You need to choose people that are going to not just invest in you, but are going to continue to partner with you to win that business. And you know, I'll say that we are entirely partner-led on that. I did want to add one thing to the earlier discussion, because it's a piece of evidence to what Matthew was talking about. So if you followed anything that's happening in the sales channels within our largest SPs, the service providers have gone to the general seller, right? They eliminated all the specialty teams that knew how to sell these complex products. I'm seeing a resurgence in the specialty team. Yeah. The overlay sales team is coming back. The overlay services people internally, typically retired as a consulting basis, coming back in. And what this is an acknowledgement that the general sellers are still necessary, absolutely, from a relationship perspective, but unless you have that specific technical knowledge or expertise, you simply can't complete these complex sales.
Yeah, and I would actually say that one of the common conversations we have inside GenBand is just the fact that when we talk about people moving to something like our Nuvia service, the first thing we say now is you shouldn't start worrying about the technology. The first thing you should do is worry about how you're going to fix your compensation plan, so that people are used to selling and getting paid for boxes have a way to make money on cloud services.
One last point on that. We're moving from what was a supply paradigm, so throughout the VAR channel, the distribution channel, to the end customer, to an adoption paradigm. So everybody now in that life cycle is going to be interested in the adoption of the end user, because that's how we get paid now. Right. Before, we didn't care, because we just moved a box down, and we have people who are really good at storing and moving boxes, and so that paradigm is going to change everybody's role. And I think the VAR might actually appear to be the person who can do the integration. So one of the key things still here is going to be, how do I integrate all these cloud pieces together? And some of the smart VARs, and we heard some stuff from a couple of guys yesterday who seem to change their business in that way. So I think that's where they may have a role, but it won't be supply, it'll be adoption now.
Yeah, so you believe in the old model where there's mystery, there's margin, right? So speaking of paradigm shifts, it's pretty clear that Microsoft is going to become competition for many of the people in this room. They're, you know, depending on what you read and so on, you hear that sometime this summer they plan to add dial tone directly to Skype for Business. So I'm curious to know, what do you all think that means for this audience?
Just an observation to maybe start a discussion. The exposure we've had to Link, I'll call it, is that it seems to be a DIY type of phone system. Right. And the support structure is some young guy, well, maybe not so young, but some guy who knows
relative to the panel, perhaps.
Yeah, young guy. Okay, that knows how to hit blogs to find solutions, because no one else knows the answers. And Microsoft, particularly for a smaller organization, can be difficult or expensive to penetrate. So in our interactions with the whole process, it really has seemed like DIY, and you just sort of trip your way through the installation process to get the system working like you want it to work. And once you do that, man, you're in. I mean, you're emotionally committed to this thing, and you know, you better dedicate yourself to keeping it running.
And what about the margins? So, you know, I think one of my biggest concerns is just the fact that, you know, Microsoft is very good at protecting their own margins, and I'm concerned, frankly, that what they'll do is commoditize dial tone in order to protect their own margins, and so they'll essentially undercut the market and wholesale dial tone and make it as cheap as they can.
I'm still amazed at how Microsoft gained so much sort of presence in delivering voice, where they've been trying to deliver it, what, for 5 years? I mean, some of your predecessors in this room were with Nortel, were one of the many companies that went into an alliance, many PBX guys, and now we're still believing that they're going to win that voice battle, you know, 6 years later. And when I ever ask any of the Microsoft analytics people for sort of hard facts about really how many people are using voice, you know, in our markets, maybe it's different here, it's, well, one, we don't get them, but secondly, when I look at the evidence, it's still very small. Sure, messaging and presence, there's no doubt, but on the voice side, we're still yet to see the penetration into the enterprise and the SME. And the service provider solutions they offer for multi-tenanted, if you look at some of the technical designs of those, and you know, you'll have a second thought. So,
So Polycom's a huge Microsoft partner, and we do a lot of business in our OpenSIP world. So just to give you just some high-level facts, we sell about 6 times as many OpenSIP phones as we do Link phones. However, one of the opportunities for everyone in this room that's delivering high-quality voice is the fact that Microsoft is going to spend upwards of $500 million on marketing UC to the enterprise. In other words, they're going to spend a lot of money educating all of our potential customers. Now, your opportunity is one of two things. You can go dead on into that, and you can attempt to change religion, which is often what IT department sales are about, right? You have to get somebody to move from a decision they've made to something else. Or you can look for opportunities, and I think this whole voice opportunity, basically with dual homing, right? In other words, don't fight the battle. If you want to use Link Voice internally, that's great. But if you're going to use if you're expecting enterprise class features and functionalities, you have no choice but to go with a Gen Band-like solution. They just don't have the functionality that you take for granted. If you're going to be taking out Cisco Call Manager, you're not going to be putting in Link and expecting that same set of functionality. In terms of commoditization, I thought Skype did that 7 years ago, right? It was free. We could all dial anywhere in the world for free, but we're all still selling and buying voice services. The reason is because when we pick up the phone and it doesn't work, we're not going to send an email to somebody, right? We expect it to be on all the time. I think that's the difference between near-time, IM&P, and real-time services like voice and video. When you invest in those and you pay for them, you expect them to work.
And I agree, but I think it will come. I think that, you know, as time goes on, those improvements are going to develop to where those products are functioning very, very well. And I think we're seeing that in so many other areas. And I think that again, it goes down that we've got to make sure that we are very cost effective, that we are variable, that we are watching all the sectors, and we're watching all the factors on this, and we actually have to come alongside and help interpret that. Because if you've got any giant business, you talk about Microsoft or Google or AT&T, any of the major carriers, anything that's a hundreds of billions of dollars worth of enterprise value, they can make those investments, but they can move at a speed that's faster than what a lot of the end clients are. So there's an interpretation piece that's required. There's an integration piece. There's a piece that all of us have an opportunity to participate in to help assist that. And at the end of the day, it moves it all toward that direction that they, because they are going to be successful. I mean, when you put that much money in, you put that much investment in, they are going to be successful. So I think that our opportunities as an industry are to come alongside and to help support those.
Any other comments? All right. So kind of staying with this whole cloud theme. So one of the interesting things is obviously the cloud is being, you know, in and of itself, it means relatively speaking, scale. So what do you think happens to a lot of the smaller players, the niche providers today, when we move to a much more cloud-centric environment? I mean, some people might say, hey, you're finally creating open APIs that I can actually connect to, and that's going to help me. But other people saying, hey, how will they, you know, it's like the apps in the App Store. You know, it's great that you have one, but you're one of the 30 million, so how do you distinguish yourself? So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
They'll move quicker and more agilely than most of the people in the room. So what they'll do, and the ones we're seeing who are successful, they're moving quicker to understand their customer requirements. So they're integrating with the right applications, and they're focusing on that. They're focusing on doing things differently. So we've got lots of small players in Europe focusing on offering international services, because they're moved quicker than the incumbent, who look at that and say, well, that's pretty hard to do. So they'll move quicker. They'll probably be focused on integration, and they'll understand their customers and vertical segments better, and they'll produce solutions, and they'll still be around.
Yeah. So I agree. I think smaller players have to use the cloud to their advantage, the scale to their advantage, and it actually, I think, helps them tremendously in being able to use cloud services, overlay their brand and their services on top of that, so that they can get closer to their customers and understand their business processes, even more, and to maybe specialize a bit more.
Yeah, I would say that the smaller players are going to become what I call cloud innovators and integrators. In other words, they're going to deliver one key service, whatever that is, and then they're going to go out and find partners in the cloud, and they're going to bring together a solution that, to your point earlier, is all about focus. You're going to pick an industry, a vertical, or a business process, and that's what you're going to hang your hat on. Because if you don't differentiate, you're either going to lose to those that do, or you're going to lose to those that have such massive scale and financial resources that it's very difficult to compete against.
All right, so last question, exit question. I want to talk a little bit about predictions. So we'll make everybody answer quickly. Do you think that, do any of you think, and let me give a little context. So today, the latest numbers suggest that in North America at least, about 250,000 seats in Q4 went to hosted cloud services. And that's roughly makes that, if you took the cloud as one of the vendors versus the IPPBX vendors, that makes that about the fourth largest vendor in the marketplace, relatively speaking. So I guess my question is, does anyone think that hosted sales will become the #1 vendor, so to speak, in the IPPBX or business services market in either the next 24 or 48 months or some period thereafter? And I'm actually going to go right down the list, and I'll put everybody right on the spot.
So, sure, thanks for all start.
You can pick a random number like 31 and a half months if it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to actually say it's probably closer to 4 years, but I'm going to say absolutely it will surpass, because it goes back to the variable cost, goes back to the flexibility, goes back to with small service providers, and there'll be niches. I think that companies are, as they find their IT, as they find that they want to stop this empire building within their own organizations, and they have to from a cost perspective, I think it's inevitable. So I'm going to say closer to 48 months, but I'm absolutely.
48, 49, you can say without going
I'm going to go 46 and a half.
Okay, good deal.
I'm going to answer for the rest of the world.
Okay, good.
I don't know what goes on here.
Somebody's got to do it.
In Holland this quarter, I think there'll be more hosted PBX sold, seats sold than traditional seats sold. Some figures I've just been hearing from my analysts. But in other markets, it'll be 8 to 10 years. So it depends on the market demographics, the conditions of that specific market.
Ronnie?
Well, I was hoping I'd go last so I could take everyone else's answer.
Just average it out?
Yes. I'm going to go longer than shorter. I'll go the 24 to 48 months. And the reason being is it's not as easy as it looks. Because, as I said earlier, we're supposed to make this stuff look easy. And there's so many, you develop the software so it can do these things. You then have to develop the processes so that it looks seamless to the customer. So I think we've got a ways to go on that.
So I'd give North America 36 months. We're seeing 30% year-on-year growth. We're seeing an immediate decline in the number of on-premise devices that are being deployed for call control. I don't think there's any doubt. I think that in Europe, I would agree. I think it's a longer time frame, but I'll tell you, markets like Australia, I'd be surprised if right today they're selling more on-premise seats than hosted.
Greg, you get the last word.
The last word. Okay. I'd say 2 to 3 years in North America. I think, clearly the economics say that you shouldn't have premises-based PBX. It's much more efficient to keep it in the cloud. And combine that with a lot of the other transformations that network operators are doing regarding, SDN and NFV and integrating, fixed mobile convergence. I think, it'll continue to just only gain momentum in North America.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone joining me on stage today, and thank you. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're now breaking for lunch with the Candy Mobile, followed by the Solution Showcase at 12:30. Have a great day.